Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with a continuation of our Sunday school lesson as we work our way through the Old Testament in a scholarly presentation to try to bring you a lot of the insights that you don't get traditionally in a Sunday school or routine church service. We're going to look at two different people today. One of them is a minor prophet, Habakkuk, who gets very little publicity, press, whatever you want to say, in the modern church. And Jeremiah, who's one of the giants of the prophets, and we'll do 3 or 4 lessons on Jeremiah to try to cover him as we can. Habakkuk is a short, to the point, 3-chapter minor prophets. Remember that there are 12 minor prophets. They put them enough of them together to make up one scroll. They didn't have books in those days when they compiled this, so they put it together enough of the minor prophets to make a full scroll equivalent to the scroll of Jeremiah or Isaiah, Ezekiel, things like that. And it's short, and it's very interesting to me. I've enjoyed it particularly, and I've heard it read one time in church that I can remember. And I think it really should get a lot more interest from more modern Christians than a lot of the other Old Testament ones. And I find it one of the more interesting ones. He's beginning to raise the question of are we supposed to expect benefits from being good and faithful to the Lord? Because he starts off with, he does get quoted on the "How long, O Lord, how long?" is how he starts. And he laments of the fate of his compatriots not being loyal to the Lord, not being religious, not maintaining, keeping the covenant, and all that. But at the end, you can clearly pick up that he's saying, even if we are we going to get rewarded? And it's kind of the bridge between the Deuteronomic writers and the Christian era. And you get to the end of it, at the end of the 3rd chapter, like I said, it's very brief, that it really, he says, he's the first person to say, we should have faith and trust in the Lord just for its own sake. Not that it's going to get us anything. Not that it's going to keep us safe. Not that it's going to make us wealthy. He doesn't say any of those things, but that's implied. We should do this because it's the right thing to do. And that's much more along the lines of what became the Christian belief in the reason for our faith. We don't believe that we are going to, in modern life, be rewarded in the living for our faith, but we're rewarded in the afterlife to spend the afterlife with God. So this is an interesting approach that emerges here. This is right about the time of good King Josiah and Jeremiah is when this is written. Later, as the histories are compiled, you will find that what's called the Deuteronomic history, which is Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, they tend to have a formula that so-and-so did what was right by the Lord and he was rewarded, and so-and-so was terrible and blah, blah, blah. But even when you read it carefully, you see that there's no reward for being good necessarily. David was blessed, but other kings weren't. Josiah was a very good king, but he gets killed on the battlefield at a relatively young age. All his reforms get undone. But so you don't find that, and they don't have a solution to that. They really try to say from the beginning of the Deuteronomic history, if you do right by the Lord, you're going to be rewarded, and you'll get good land, and you'll be prosperous, and this, that. And it doesn't work out. And it's when people go into the exile and start to come back from the exile that you'll see some writings are beginning to say, well, we need to understand why we're not getting these kind of rewards. And this is an important thing because this has always been with our religious life. And we'll deal with it later and other things, but this is still with us. We have a group now, and it's a long-term thing in Christianity, what they call the prosperity gospel. It makes me cringe because there is no prosperity gospel in the New Testament. There's no promise of a reward in this life, riches and all that. A lot of pastors like to do this because if they attract a bunch of rich people, they'll probably get a lot of good donations themselves, and they'll be able to live like a rich person. There is no prosperity gospel in the New Testament. This is plain old heresy, any way you want to cut it. Now, I'm not a prophet, I'm just a describer of this. So it's an interesting thing, and we've seen the evolution away from that if you're properly following Jesus' teaching in the Scripture. Remember, he commented on the evils of money far more than they did on the evils of sex. That you can't love God and money, he says over and over and over again. So anyway, Habakkuk is the first bridge between the deeply Old Testament approach, I'll be good and do this and you'll reward me, to saying, well, I'm going to be good because it's the right thing to do and we'll see what happens. Because that's really more the Christian approach. We are not promised in Christianity that a good life in this world is going to reward us in this world. It might and it might not. But that's not the deal. The deal is for life in the hereafter. One very interesting episode at church years ago when they were having people from the congregation speak, and this guy gets up and says, I know I'm such a good Christian because I'm doing so well in business. And my wife grabs me on the thigh and holds me to keep me from jumping up and saying, you got it all wrong, and I didn't say a word. I talked to the pastor years later, and he laughed and said, you should have said something. I said, no, my wife was right. Just to let it go. I'm not going to be the one to tell anybody what to do. But this is with us, and it's just not true in Christianity. That's my one little sermonette for the whole class about this. So it's a nice thing. Habakkuk's a nice, pleasant read. Read it sometime when you get a chance, and you'll see that right in the last part he talks about you do this for its own reason. So I've heard it one time, and it was someone from the conference was coming and speaking at Jerome at one of our organizational meetings, and he quoted it. And I went up and talked to him afterwards, and so I was really glad he had, because I really enjoyed Habakkuk having taught the Bible. He was very, he was happy that someone remembered it, because most people don't even know that it's there. Now we're going to move on to Jeremiah. We'll cover Jeremiah. We covered him last week. We'll cover him this week, and either one or two more lessons. I haven't decided exactly, but he's going to be getting major play. Now he's a very interesting prophet. He covers a long time. He covers a whole bunch of the kings, and he actually goes up until the exile and the Babylonian conquest, and apparently goes off to Egypt after the second conquest. So he gets a lot of play here, and he's a major prophet. He is not easy to describe in a class like this. He's very popular with pastors because he has a number of great lessons that are called oracles, that he'll have a lesson about the waistcoat that he was wearing, and he had to take it up and bury it, came back and get it later and it was raggedy, or the pottery that he made and it was broken, or the scroll that he dictated and they gave it to the evil king who cut it up piece by piece and threw it in the fire. He's got a lot of great lessons, so he's excellent for sermons. But that kind of, if you look at the book, it's not at all organized chronologically at all. The first 25 chapters or so are his basic oracles, but they're not even arranged chronologically. You'll go into chapter 4 or 5, and that'll be much later or much earlier, and it doesn't follow. So it's very difficult to present in this kind of scholarly session. So I'm not going to do a whole lot. I'll just mention them as we go along. He will span, like I said, several kings: evil King Manasseh, good King Josiah, Josiah's death, and Josiah is replaced by an Egyptian puppet who is immediately replaced by another one who comes, King Jehoiakim, and he's the rival standing up to the evil King Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim clearly wants to kill him, but he's protected by some prominent people in the culture. You get the impression that there really were two major groups dueling for the king's attention. There was a group that was sincere in their belief, probably from the Levite community, the professional priests and teachers of the law, and they supported King Josiah, they supported Jeremiah, they protected him. And then a lot of the average folk probably were fine with all this pagan stuff. They probably had household gods in their houses. Remember, I said that the Israelis find household gods, small gods. I showed you something that they looked at a couple weeks ago. and they find them in the archaeology, and then after the Babylonian exile, they disappear. So they were probably very comfortable with this. So Jehoiakim comes in and after his father, and he goes right back to the bad old days. And he makes it even worse. So he puts the idols back in the temple. He starts having worship to Baal again and to Ashtart, Baal's consort. He starts child sacrifice again. It doesn't say that he starts the necromancers up again, but he does all these things. So he's right back into it, and you just go, oh my gosh, here he is. And then his father, Josiah, really was like King David, very successful, very popular, theologically sound, lover of the Lord. This guy, Jehoiakim, acts more like King Solomon. If you remember the history carefully, Solomon, even though he gets a lot of press in the modern thing, he was very abusive of his population. He taxed them very heavily. He made them do forced labor, slave labor, 3 months a year and then 3 months off and 3 months back, building his own projects. Jehoiakim starts doing this again, and he's very abusive of the people. He taxes them heavily because he has to pay tribute, bribes basically, to the foreign kings that have set him up on the throne. So this is really tough. But you will find these various battles scattered through the first 25 chapters, which is what we look at in Jeremiah. Like I said, there are a collection of oracles, 2 or 3 chapters to each of these lessons, but there's no order to them. There's no chronology. And this is why he's great for the sermons, but it's really tough for my role of trying to teach this academically. So after Josiah's death, there's a 3-month, the Egyptians pick one of his sons and put him on the throne, and that guy only lasts 3 months, and they take him off and put Jehoiakim on, and he is a vassal, i.e., a subordinate king. He does what the Egyptians tell him what to do, because the Egyptians had killed his father in a battle up in Megiddo. So he goes right back hog wild into the paganism. And clearly he had some support, because there was a lot of support for doing this. And Jeremiah goes ape. Okay, he just goes wild about this, because here you'd seen under Josiah that a really royal effort to clean up the faith, to get rid of all this pagan nonsense and all this sacrilege and stuff. And he goes ape. Well, he's so vocal in his criticism, they ban him from the temple. That's interesting that you ban a prophet from the temple. But prophet's an unofficial category. They probably had a lot of positive prophets who would say whatever the king wanted them to say, just to get along. So they ban him from the temple. And then there are a series of incidents. So he dictates a scroll to a guy named Baruch. Baruch is his scribe who writes down what he says. So the reason we have all these various oracles is that Baruch wrote them down. So Jeremiah can't go into the temple and can't confront the king. The palace is right next to the temple. And so he takes the scroll in, and he'll read a couple lines, and the king Jehoiakim is sitting there warming himself with a grill with some burning embers in it. And he'll read him a couple lines, and Jehoiakim will take his knife or scissors and cut those lines off and throw them in the fire and burn them. And Baruch goes on and reads the next one, and the king cuts it off and throws it in the fire the next one. I thought, well, that means the king really doesn't like what he's hearing, which means Jeremiah is probably correct. And a variety of I'm just going to touch on some of his other things. He's very critical of the abuse of the poor by the wealthy, of using the tax system to oppress the poor and for the powerful people to benefit themselves. There's a big temple tax there also. So he describes the temple as a den of robbers, oppressing the poor. Now, who else used this term to describe the temple? Jesus did. So you do find that some of these things reappear in the Christian era, because Jesus was very clearly about people using the temple to make money. And I'm certain when Jesus cleared the temple and drove the money changers out, everybody thought, we don't have any problem with this, so they can make some money on the temple, that's fine. But he said, you can't make the money in the Lord's house. So again, that's something that popped up with Jeremiah before he later makes a very interesting point about condemning the practice of sacrifice. It's interesting because if you think about it, I thought, why is he condemning that? Well, his condemnation was we need to go back to the pure Mosaic covenant from Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Doesn't matter which way you want to call it. It has two different names. And they didn't talk about animal sacrifice at Mount Sinai. And they didn't. We've covered that. They didn't talk about it. There was no effort to, didn't have the animal sacrifice anyway. But they didn't talk about it. They talked about devotion to the Lord, devotion to the Torah, which people translate as law, but it really is teaching. Devotion to the Lord's teaching. That sacrifice is adopted when they get into the Holy Land and settle down, and it's adopted from the fertility cults. Isn't that an interesting irony? It's a very interesting irony that I've never thought of in all my years of studying the Old Testament. I've never seen it until this point, that it's a very interesting observation that he condemned animal sacrifice. Now, I understand why people did animal sacrifice. They didn't have coinage in Palestine in those days. It was just being introduced up in the Greek world about this time, and it hadn't come down. They had pieces of silver. They called them a shekel. That's a weight thing rather than a stamped coin with the king's picture on it or something like that. And animal sacrifice was the way you could show your devotion by giving up something of value. But it's interesting that he critiqued it because they had adopted this, adopted, whatever the word would be, from the fertility cults. So he condemns it even as a sacrifice to Yahweh, since it's not part of the Sinai-Moses covenant. Isn't that interesting? I just find that amazing. And he further predicts that Judah will be conquered again and sent into exile like the northern kingdom. He talks about the foe from the north. And this becomes even more striking, scary, a few years later. In 609 is when Nineveh had fallen. 609 is when Nineveh falls to the capital Assyria. Assyria falls to the Babylonians. And Josiah had been killed about 7 or 8 years before that by the Egyptians. After there's the Battle of Carchemish in 605. 609 is when Nineveh fell to the Babylonians. In 605 BC, there's a big battle between the Egyptians and the Babylonians as to who's going to be the boss empire of the Middle East. And the Babylonians win and drive the Egyptians all the way back into Egypt. And I don't know whether they conquered part of Egypt or not. It's very difficult to conquer Egypt from outside because you got to come across the Sinai and the desert, and there's only a few ways to get across. It's very difficult to do in a large population in Egypt. And so they drive them out, and suddenly, instead of having the Egyptians there at the bosses, you've got the threat from the Babylonians. And the Babylonians are even nastier than the Assyrian Empire was going to be. They adopted a lot of their customs like exile and all that. And so Jeremiah starts predicting of the foe from the north, the danger from the north that's going to come down. Now you think when Babylon's due east, it is, but they didn't go across what's now eastern Jordan and western Iraq, right across the desert. There's no water there. So the transportation is up through the Fertile Crescent, up between the Tigris and the Euphrates, up into what's northern Iraq, central Syria, and then down the coastal plain. That's the way. So even though it was from the Babylonians, they would be coming from the north to threaten Jerusalem. And he keeps saying, this threat is coming, this threat is coming. He makes some other predictions. He laments that there's no balm in Gilead, B-A-L-M, in Gilead. Gilead is an area to the east of the Jordan River where they had a lot of succulent plants that produced various fragrances and that they could use as ointments and stuff like that. So the balm in Gilead is a reference to a real calming type of treatments that they would get from that area. He laments the corruption in the hearts of the population. And this is really the fundamental problem, because the people are tolerating these kings putting in all this paganism, because there's probably a lot of support for it at the local personal level anyway. A lot of people, we don't really care, blah, blah, blah. And this just drives Jeremiah wild, because you can't do that in this situation. You have to maintain your faith and your allegiance to the one God. And he is predicting a catastrophe coming, because God is at work in history. And this is a tough one. But the time of the sequence of God's work is unclear. And this is a tough one because God is clearly working in history through this time. But the only way to cure out this is the culmination of what I call the 700-year war with the fertility cults, with the Baals, coming right at this time. And so it's infested in the culture, it's endemic, they can't get it out. So, and they've had these good kings. Hezekiah tried to get rid of it, Josiah tried to get rid of it. The population just keeps going back to it, typical human behavior. And so he said, God is active in history, and God is going to get this straightened out. And so, since God is out beyond time, then God will send them into exile into Babylonia, and that will clean them out. And it actually works. When they come back from exile, you don't find any more household gods in the houses. You don't find any struggle with the fertility cults anymore. When we get to the later writings, you have a lot of questions about this and that and other things, but you don't have much struggle with the fertility cults until the Greeks come along a couple hundred years later. So this is a tough time for Jeremiah, and he's seeing this disaster come, and nobody's listening to him. And so it's very frustrating. I've never been a prophet, but I imagine it's really scary to see the Babylonians crush the Egyptians. The Egyptians were bad enough in 605. Carchemish, they drive them back all the way back into Egypt, and they become the dominant power, and they are really nasty. So Jeremiah continues to preach impending doom, which is coming unless you restore your faith in the Lord. Restore your faith in the Lord. It isn't going to happen. And I don't know whether Jeremiah actually knew it was going to happen or not. Was he hoping that people would listen to him? I doubt that they did listen to him much. Clearly the king wasn't listening. The kings have decided we're going to have to be a vassal to whatever's the big power in the area. We're just going to do it and put up with it. And I doubt that the king had much faith in the Lord anyway. It's just a thing to him. So he kept predicting this, and this disaster is coming. So we're going to stop here. Like I said, this is not an easy lesson to present. We're going to stop here. Now, we're going to have a 2-week time frame here where it won't be taping next week. I need a week off, and Eric needs a week off. So in 2 weeks, it'll be, the reading is 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 28 to 35. Then chapter 24 and chapter 25. This is the Babylonian conquest. This is the end of the line for the kingdom of Judah. Kaboom. And there's a series of bad steps, and it's covered right to the point, and we'll go through it in as much detail as we can. Then parts of Jeremiah, 11 through 21, a variety of these oracles again. You don't have to read them in intense detail, but look through them and it shows what he's predicting. And then chapter 23, it's very interesting because here's the beginning of a messianic prophecy. The Savior from the house of David will come and save us. And you do find these things. Now this is written, 600 years before Jesus came. So it's an interesting appearance. You're starting to see this tidbit. You'll see a lot of it when we get into the second part of Isaiah. So this is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you for bearing with me. I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.